Hello. Happy tax day to everyone in the US. I know, Jeremy, it's like amazing that we we chose to have this on tax day. I'm done with my taxes, thank God. But I know this is a big day for a lot of folks. So thank you all for joining us, everyone who is here. Super awesome. We are going to be getting started in just a few minutes. But in the meantime, as Bev has done in the chat, if you could hop in and say hello and where you are, I want to say dialing in from, where you are watching this from, that would be cool. I'd love to just get to know everybody and where in this wonderful world you are. Jeremy, where in this wonderful world are you right now?
I am in a small town in Italy called Ormea. This is my first time to Italy, so I don't really know the geography that well, but it's in the kind of like, I don't know if you would call it a panhandle, but not the boot bit, the over in the northwest, I suppose, near France.
Awesome. Lovely. Very cool. Let's see, Alamosa, Colorado, Tampa, Florida. I am in Rhode Island. It's not even worth mentioning the city because the state is so small. It's just like, it's the size of a city.
Makes it easy.
Yep. We'll give folks just another couple minutes to join if they're running a few minutes late. And I'll introduce Jeremy and we'll get started. In the meantime, folks who are just joining, if you could hop in the chat and say hello and where you are watching from today, that would be cool. If you want to share a bit about your podcast, that would be cool too. It'd be great for us to get to know you and kind of where you are on your podcasting journey. So I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just getting started. I'm Dave Jackson. I saw Dave registered. I'm Dave Jackson. I'm a pro and I know more than these guys. That would be cool too. So would love to just hear about folks' kind of podcasting experience and where you are in that journey. And I say journey because, like Jeremy, we were talking, like it's never done, right? You're never like, oh, my podcast is complete. I'm good. It's always a work in progress.
Yeah, maybe if you suppose had like a seasonal or like a one season or something like that, short run series. But yeah, for most people, I always kind of like chuckle at that. I don't know. I guess growing out of it now, where it's just like you think that there's some endpoint to it, and then you're like, wait, the thing I'm trying to do is to get to a point where I can do more of this, and maybe I'm getting paid for it or whatever, but I keep doing this forever, ostensibly. So there is no endpoint. Hopefully, it becomes more maybe monetarily rewarding at some point for a lot of people. But I think ultimately, like winning the game is getting to keep playing it and keep producing more episodes. So hopefully, you're creating a show you actually like.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. Well, let's dive in. Jeremy Enns. Pleasure to have you on today. Jeremy is the founder of Podcast Marketing Academy. And is going to be talking with us all about creating like a winning strategy for podcast growth, having an actual process that we can follow to effectively promote our podcast and grow our audience. I will speak for myself. This is something that we do very poorly at Castos with our podcasts. We're going to have a new one as of next week. And so I'm super excited to get to pick Jeremy's brain about how he likes to see this and coaches his clients on this. Jeremy, you want to say anything more about yourself before you get started?
Yeah. So Craig and we first connected 7 years ago, something like that, where I actually started out as a podcast editor. My background is in audio engineering. And so I wanted to work in the music business and then kind of found my way into podcasting when I believe you were living in France at the time. And I was wanting to start traveling full time. And so podcasting kind of fit with this location independent type of business and kind of took my skills into that and started off working for Craig at Podcast Motor, which I was going to say is your old company, but I think it's still going in the background. Is that right?
Still lives. Yep. We call it Castos Productions now. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. And so we got to know each other then. And since I went on to start my own production agency, which now also kind of just runs in the background, kind of scaling that down as I've gotten way more into the marketing and marketing education side of podcasting, which is what I really enjoy doing myself the most. And so that's where most of my time and attention is these days. And so that's, I've got a couple, a membership community and a live 6-week course. And those are kind of the main components of that business, along with a bunch of content, things like that. So that's the general kind of background on me. And I guess if we're ready, I can jump into the slides and can share my screen and we can get started. So
While Jeremy's getting his slides up, just wanted to mention in the right sidebar of your screen, if you're in like a desktop, you have an option for Q&A and chat. Please drop questions in as you have them for Jeremy or I. Would love this to be really interactive. This is not a presentation. This is us sharing what we know, and the best way to do that, I think, is with questions. So as you'll have questions, drop them in there. I will gracefully interrupt Jeremy, hopefully, and we'll tackle those as they come.
Perfect. All right. And everybody can see my slides up on the screen?
Good for me. If we could have a couple folks mention in chat, if you can see Jeremy's slide here. Yes, Marianne, thank you. All right.
So let's get started. So like Craig mentioned, we're talking all about creating a winning growth strategy for your podcast. And the word I want to emphasize in this title here is strategy. And I think that this is probably a vastly overused word and maybe understood word, if that is a phrase. Because I think when we're thinking about strategy, we're talking about more than just individual tactics or social platforms or any of those things. It's how all of these things work together to allow us to grow our shows. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, kind of a high level overview and how these different pieces fit together and why, when we're not experiencing growth, usually it's because we have a large gap in our larger strategy. So we might be pursuing a bunch of individual tactics, but we're not getting the results we want because we're missing some bigger pieces. So I want to start off with a personal story. I write 2 newsletters at this point. This graph going back to 2020 is when I was, at the start of the graph, I was just writing 1 newsletter a week. At the end, I was writing 2 newsletters a week as well as a podcast at the time. But this is my my email list growth, which is my kind of main business creator metric that I track. And so if we look back here, we can see that over the course of this year, maybe about a year there, I was doing a lot of marketing here. So as I mentioned, I had started out with 1 newsletter, was writing that once a week. I started another newsletter at some point in there. I was also producing a podcast. All of those were weekly kind of content marketing endeavors. And I was seeing some growth from those things when it came to my email subscribers. But, overall, 32 subscribers per month on average is not a whole lot. And both of those, or you can see the 2 kind of spikes there where there was a big chunk where, it was actually, I think the net number of subscribers was actually declining despite putting out new newsletters, new podcast episodes every single week. And so I think probably a lot of people can relate to this. We're putting out more and more content. We think that this is going to be the thing that's going to grow our platform, our podcast, our newsletters, our social accounts, and it doesn't always work out that way. And that is something that I certainly was running up against here. And so as I approached the end of 2021, I realized that, okay, I am spending a lot of my kind of weekly working hours on what I was considering marketing. So content creation, all the stuff that goes along with that, promoting the podcast, promoting the newsletters, all those things, spending a lot of time on marketing and was just not really seeing the growth that I was really after and the reason I was doing a lot of these things. And so at the end of the year, over the Christmas holidays, I took some time off and I did a bit of an audit of all of my platform. And I started to get curious about like, what am I doing and why isn't this working as well as I want? And I'll get to what I looked at in a second. But essentially after that point, after doing this audit, things started changing pretty quickly. And so we can see from the previous kind of almost 2 years, year and a half, something like that, was at 32 subscribers a month to my email list. And after that, over the next few months, it was averaging 183 subscribers a month. And then toward the end of last year and into the start of this year, was averaging over 700, almost 800 new subscribers a month. And I believe last month or something, the past 2 months had been around 1,500 new subscribers a month of growth. And so clearly something changed in the strategy after kind of doing a bit of an examination into my own marketing system and my own marketing strategy. I made some changes that led to some dramatically different results. So what changed was that, like I mentioned, I did an audit. And this may be a little bit small, but we'll get into the different categories here in the breakdown in a second. But essentially what I did is I just listed out every single thing that I was doing related to my creator business. And so I was looking at products I had. I was looking at how I was promoting my newsletters. I was looking at the newsletters. I was looking at the podcast, all of these different things. Everything that I was doing that kind of was in the category of marketing. And I just listed it all down. This was in a Figma file here. but you could certainly do this in any kind of note-taking app or on pen and paper. I wrote them all down and I categorized them. And so I said, like, okay, well, what are all the things I'm doing here that are related to getting more exposure to my work? What are the things that are, making it really appealing to people to join my email list in the first place or to listen to my podcast? What are the assets that I have there that are working for me in that regard? I looked at the kind of retention. So what was the things that I was doing, the content that I was creating that was going to keep people in my ecosystem, keep them coming back after they first came across me the first time? And then finally, I looked at, how am I monetizing my work? What are the products that I have? Are these the right products? Which ones am I spending a lot of time on that I've never sold one of these, or I've sold a few of these, but I keep promoting it and no one's buying it? What are the things that I have, maybe, other kinds of services or things like that that do really well for me that maybe I'm not focusing as much on? And so I basically got everything out on paper. And what I realized in doing this was that marketing, for me, at some point, in the past, I had felt a lot like this, where it's kind of just like, there's that end point you're searching for at somewhere in the middle of this kind of big amorphous blob. You don't really know what you're doing, though. You're kind of bumping into things in the dark, stumbling around, just like, oh, somebody said I should do this thing. Well, I'm going to do that. But I don't really know why I'm doing that, other than like it seems to be working for someone else. And after going through this kind of audit process and categorizing everything that I was doing with my marketing felt a lot more like this. It felt structured. It felt like there was a system. It felt like there was a clear progression of the different tasks. And each of them fit into one of these 4 categories. And so, as I kind of mentioned briefly, those categories are attraction, retention, or I should start with actually exposure, attraction, retention, and then monetization or sales or revenue, however you think about that for your business and show. And so essentially these 4 categories represent the 4 kind of challenges that we need to be addressing with our marketing. And I kind of think of them as a bit of a bridge. And so without any one of those slats in our marketing, we could have 3 out of 4, any 3 out of 4, and our marketing is still not going to work as well as we would hope. And potentially, if we were missing even just one of those, it won't work at all. And so, for example, if we have a really attractive podcast, when we get it in front of people, their eyes light up and they want to listen to it immediately. We have great content that keeps them coming back, and we have a way to monetize that content as well. Even if we have all 3 of those, if we don't have a way to get exposure to new people, our marketing isn't really going to work because we're going to be stuck with exactly how many people we have right now. We could look at other combinations as well, where maybe we can get in front of a ton of people. And once we get people into the show, they stick around and we have a way to monetize. But there's this attraction piece is missing where we don't know how to talk about the show. Maybe our design is poor. And so all that exposure is going to waste because nobody's actually clicking through to our show and listening to an episode. And so regardless of, which piece you might be missing, any one of those could be undermining your entire marketing system. And so today we're going to look at each of these different components of your marketing system. And we're going to look at some ways to identify where the gaps might be for you, as well as some ideas on how you can close those gaps if you realize that, well, this is the thing that is holding me back right now. So let's start off with exposure. So this is the first one. And this is really, we're going to go through these in the order that a new potential listener would interact with us in our ecosystem. So of course, to start off, they need to get, our show needs to be presented to them in some way. That may be in one of the listening apps. It could be through social media. Maybe it's through doing guesting on another show or a cross promo. Any way that it first comes across them, this is really the first step that kicks off the entire cycle. And I would imagine that if everyone here on the call is like most creators that I talk to, this is probably the single most neglected category of marketing for most creators. And so I think that, a lot of us go into podcasting, go into any kind of content creation with this idea of, well, I'm going to build a great show and people are going to find it. And that was to some extent how things worked, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago in podcasting, where I know a lot of my early clients, and I'm guessing a lot of Craig's early clients as well, were able to build huge audiences, tens of thousands of downloads per episode, basically without doing any marketing whatsoever, just by putting out episodes that were pretty good quality, nothing like incredible, but there just wasn't that much noise, wasn't that much competition. And so there was maybe, a handful of shows on any given niche. And a lot of times there was just one show on that niche. And so that show grew fairly significantly. Whereas now, if you look today, there are, often dozens of shows on a given topic. And so it's that much harder to stand out, and organic growth is very hard to come by. And so, we know probably everybody here is aware that podcasting does not have any kind of inbuilt discoverability, But that's not necessarily all that uncommon. I would say like every business that has ever existed doesn't really have built-in discoverability. Those have to be marketed. There is like Amazon with books and things like that has some discoverability, but that's really most books on Amazon. I would imagine it's a tiny fraction of percent that are actually getting regularly boosted in the algorithm. So most books don't have discoverability. There's actually a very small number of platforms that have, a meaningful discovery mechanism. And so podcasting, we're in the same boat as most other kinds of creators and businesses where it's our job to build our own discoverability engine. And this is something that we can 100% do if we know what we're doing and we approach it that way. And so the one thing before we dive a little bit deeper into exposure is that I want to emphasize that when I'm talking about exposure here, this is primarily about getting exposure to new people who have never heard about you or your show before. And so one of the things when we think about exposure, a lot of times the first thing that comes to mind might be social media and posting about our episodes on social and bringing people who are following us back to our show. The thing about it is when you think about the people who follow you on social media, they already follow you on social media, so they know who you are. And they've probably also heard about your show before. They've seen you post about it before, and they have made a decision for themselves, whether they know it or not, that, this is not a show for me. I'm not interested in it. Maybe that's just that we haven't, posted that perfect episode that is the best fit for them, but they've probably seen multiple prompts, had multiple opportunities to listen to the show, and they haven't yet. Or maybe they have listened to the show and they've said, no, that wasn't for me, and they've moved on. And so when we're talking about exposure, what we're really looking at here is how do we get in front of new people, get exposure to new audiences who have never heard about us before. And that is usually not through posting new episodes on social media. We need to look outside of that if we want to expand our overall reach. So let's start off with a bit of an analysis and see, what are some good signs that if you're doing well in the exposure category, what are some of the signs of that? And so I might say some of those ideas might be, you have lots of website traffic. And so I've certainly worked with shows that they have low podcast downloads, but they have really high website traffic, which is a good sign for exposure because it means that, okay, the problem isn't exposure. We have all this traffic. We just need to find a way to, make the podcast more compelling to people who come to the website or get it more visible on the website. But we have exposure we can tap into. Similarly, it could be large social reach. And so if you have, tens of thousands of followers on Instagram or Twitter or LinkedIn or wherever, that's an asset that you can use to get back to your podcast. And it may be that you're just not utilizing that asset correctly right now. It could also be large paid advertising reach. This could either be directly to the podcast or to your email list or a freebie or something else. But if you have, a lot of inbound traffic based on advertising, another good sign, another asset that you can leverage. If you're doing a lot of, podcast guesting appearances or collaborations with other creators, that's a great sign that you have an exposure system in place. And then the other thing that I would say is that if the vast majority of listeners, you actually don't know who they are and maybe have no idea how they found you, that's a really good sign too, that that word about your show is getting out there in ways that you might not even know how that is, but clearly there is some exposure happening because you have people coming into the show who you have no idea who they are or how they found out about you. And that's sometimes both like a scary and exciting phase of podcast growth when you get to that point when you realize like, oh, it's not just my friends and family anymore. And there's all these people who I have no idea who they are, or how they found me, or what they think of me, and that's becoming part of my audience as well. So these are all some of the good signs that exposure is not a problem keeping you back from more growth.
Hey now, Jeremy, can I interrupt for just a second?
Yeah.
First of all, folks, if you have any questions, there's a Q&A block in the right sidebar of your screen here. Would love questions, right? So hop in there, ask questions. A big part of this is being interactive and helping you out with specific things that you need. And I'm going to be selfish and ask a question that I have because our customers ask about us a lot, which is paid advertising for podcasts. I'm not sure if you're going to cover this later, but like, what's your stance on it? How do you see it done well? Kind of give us if you're not going to talk about it later, give us kind of your rundown on like paid acquisition for podcasts.
Yeah, a lot of people like to, I don't want to say brag, but like hold it as this virtuous thing to be all organic growth. And like, that's great if you can do that, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with paid acquisition of podcast listeners or email subscribers or customers for a business. And I think that's just one tool we have at our disposal. And if you have the budget for it, I would certainly experiment with it. I think this was in whose newsletter was this? I want to say it might have been in, oh, it was, okay. So it was actually in Katie, now I can't remember the last name, but she does Pod the North newsletter. And so it's a Canadian ecosystem newsletter. And she'd had a conversation maybe a month ago with a guy who's done, I don't know what agency he works at, but he's done a ton of advertising. And they shared basically all the cost per acquisition of a subscriber. And for me, I've done quite a bit of newsletter, email subscriber acquisition through advertising. And looking at how much it costs to get a podcast listener, it was like 10 or 20 times what it costs to get an email subscriber. And so my personal preference, if this is like gets into like, depending on how complex your kind of marketing skill set is, but also even like what kinds of assets you have in your kind of creator platform. And so for me, if I was doing it, if I was starting a new show today, what I would do is I would run ads specifically to my newsletter, and then I would use my newsletter to basically sell new subscribers on the podcast, because that's just going to be way, way cheaper. And once they're on the newsletter, then until they unsubscribe, you essentially get infinite opportunities to present the podcast to them and you can test out different, wordings, different episodes. You've got all these opportunities to then convert subscribers into podcast listeners. And so that would be how I think is probably the most cost effective and also most valuable, especially if you have a business where you probably want people on the email list anyway. And so if you were considering advertising for one of the other, I would do email first and then use that as an advertising platform itself for the podcast. So that would be one more kind of circuitous route to take. I know some people who've had great success advertising both on other individual shows as well as on the podcast apps. But a lot of times, like the good apps often have like a minimum like $5,000 spend or something like that. And so like when you're looking at that, you're like, okay, do I have $5,000 that I am essentially willing to throw away? Because a big part of advertising is you just don't know what will work. And the only way you'll know what works is by doing it and iterating on it. And so like I have one of my friends in a mastermind that I'm in. He's run a Facebook ad agency for 10 years and he's kind of gotten out of it now. But one of the things that I've really learned from him is like, essentially what makes for a good Facebook ads person is somebody who just knows how to tweak over like a 3 or 6 month period until you get the cost down. That like everybody's cost starts high and all your assumptions are proven wrong. And so if you run one ad, that's not worth putting any stock in whatsoever. If it works, you kind of got lucky maybe, and maybe it could have worked way better. And so I think if you're getting into advertising, you want to have more of a budget than just, I'm going to run one ad once. You want to say like, okay, what are all the various advertising channels that are available to me? So that could be Facebook. It could be the podcast listening apps. It could be directly reaching out to other shows. It could be advertising in niche newsletters related to your niche. There's like plenty of different ways that you can experiment with advertising. And you can say like, I'm going to maybe pick one of these right now. And I'm going to test out, I'm going to run, 3 ads in this same newsletter maybe and use 3 different pieces of copy, or I'm going to test out 3 different newsletters, or, I'm going to test 3 different shows in my niche and going to run ads on those. And so that would be how I would kind of approach that from a mindset perspective and just think like, okay, I need to have enough budget to test this more thoroughly than just a one-off. But also I think when you get into advertising, you want to be sure you have a way that will pay off. I think it's unwise to throw money at ads if you don't have a way to recoup that cost. Whether that's through a product or service or whether you're selling sponsorship slots. And so where advertising gets fun and also like really, I don't even say lucrative, like kind of the holy grail for a lot of advertising is if you can get new subscribers, whether that's podcast or email subscribers in at 0 cost, because then you kind of open up this like infinite growth loop where if you can just like every new person comes in, you pay $1 to get them, but you get $1 back in some way or another. Now you can just keep that cycle going and your growth can really accelerate. And so thinking about that, a lot of people they imagine that like, oh, if I just had a budget to spend on ads, like then I'd be set. That is very rarely the case because advertising, I mean, even if you have the budget, it takes so much knowledge of what variables to tweak and where to even advertise in the first place. And it's a whole black hole. So that would be my kind of thoughts on that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So when it comes to some of the common issues with exposure, and so I think the first one is a lot of us, come into podcasting and most content in particular or as a whole, and we think that, well, if I just create this thing, people are going to find it. And so if we don't realize that, that's kind of the biggest issue probably that is keeping us from actually devoting any attention to getting exposure for our work. The second one would be a lack of specificity about the people you're trying to reach. And so getting in front of groups of people who are likely to listen to your podcast is harder if you don't know who is likely to listen to your podcast. And if you think everybody is likely to listen to your podcast, that is just certainly not true. And potentially your show could be a good fit, like it has mass appeal, but it's really hard to market to that group of people in a way that is meaningful and specific with your messaging. And so the more specific you get with, even if your show is broad appeal, if you get specific with your marketing, you're going to have much better results. And so showing up in one community of people consistently is going to be very helpful in getting more exposure and convincing people to listen back to the show. The next thing would be not spending enough time on what I think of as growth-oriented activities. And so we'll look at an example of these in the next slide. But essentially, I'd like to think of most of the tasks that go into the podcast as either maintenance-oriented or growth-oriented. And maintenance-oriented tasks are kind of just like the keeping the show running, like creating content, mapping out content, all the things that need to happen for the show to exist. But none of those things actually grow the show in any way. And so what we want to do is essentially be spending, get to the point where we're spending, 30 to 50% probably of the total time you spend on the podcast, focusing on growth-oriented activities. So some of those activities that I would just list a few of them here could be setting up collaborations and cross promotions. So doing, networking with people, doing outreach, things like that. Guesting on other shows is great. Just engaging, showing up regularly. And I would just pick one niche community that is, big enough that you could, grow your show significantly, but like it's very focused in like, these are going to be the people who are going to be receptive to your show, and just showing up there every day, spending 5 or 10 minutes or 15 minutes, whatever, just adding value to that community, being a resource there. Could be experimenting with paid advertising, like we mentioned. These are some kind of common activities that I would say would fall under that growth-oriented activities list. And so you want to get to the point where maybe not all of these, but at least one of these you're spending significant amount of time on each and every week. So when it comes to how to improve your exposure, hopefully that last section has given you some ideas, some of the common mistakes, but I would experiment and identify one single listener acquisition channel that works and then double down on that. And so instead of being on 5 different social platforms, plus doing cross promotions, plus doing podcast guesting, plus also writing SEO optimized articles, plus also doing advertising, like pick one of those. And if you're going to choose social media, choose one social media platform that has the potential for discoverability, and just spend 100% of your time on that. And what you'll find is that usually you only actually need one channel to work well for you, the one way that reliably gets new listeners into the show. And if you just focus all your time and attention on that, then you're going to get way better results than trying to spread yourself out over all of these different areas. And actually, for anyone who knows Jay Klaus, he just published an article this weekend in his newsletter that basically talks about why this works that way. And I've been like waiting for somebody to publish that article for a long time. Because it's an idea that like I've thought about a lot, and I've recognized that we all want to start out by trying to do everything, but things only really ever actually start to work when we just kind of cut everything else and pick one thing that works and focus on that. The other thing, if you look at that, spending 30 to 50% of your time on growth-oriented activities and think, how am I supposed to do that? Like I already spend all of my time creating the show. Like how am I going to find that extra time in order to focus on growth? I would look at things that you can actually cut or streamline. And so there's tools like Zapier. There's AI tools. I've been using one called Swell for show notes writing and a bunch of other stuff. They just keep releasing really cool features. Alitu is another one for like podcast production that really simplifies that from like a traditional DAW to making it much more templated and kind of very, very easy to piece your episodes together. And so looking at tools like that are out there that you can use to really cut down the time of your production. And so if every episode takes you 3 hours to produce, like what can you do to get that down to an hour or hour and a half, if possible? And let's maybe say that that's on like post-production in particular. And so looking for ways to incorporate tools and systems to be able to save that time so that you can reinvest it into growth. And then the last thing would be to, I feel like every show, I know I certainly have this in many areas in my business where I do things that I don't know why I still do them. I'm just like stuck on them. But there's some kind of sunk cost. Like I've always done it this way, so I keep doing it this way. But they only add like a tiny amount of value to whatever I'm doing. And so a lot of times there are things in the way we produce our shows that they take this huge amount of time that actually, if we were to cut it, like nobody might actually even notice, or it has such a marginal impact on the listener experience that it doesn't really matter. And so looking for those things that, okay, we spend an extra 2 hours doing this thing, or this collection of tasks, but they don't really add up to any kind of meaningful outcome. And so what if we were to cut that and actually focus on growth-oriented activities, that 2 hours instead? And then, as our show starts to grow, we can maybe add in some of those things that were more nice to haves in the future as we get more time, more income, hopefully, from our shows. So that is the exposure component. And so if there's any questions, we can pause for those. Otherwise, we will move on to the next category.
No questions right now. I'll just add a little caveat on the cutting things that aren't important. It doesn't have to be a forever decision, right? I think it's totally fair to say, I'm not going to do social media and try it for a month and see what happens. And maybe that was a wrong decision, but it's a reversible decision. So you can just go back on it. And so I think I would highly encourage people to experiment with reversible decisions like that.
Yeah. And I'll say too, because you mentioned that, I'm active on Twitter, but I rarely have 2 automated posts each week, one for each of my newsletters that goes out, but I never actually promote my newsletters at all. And so all of my growth that I showed in the first slide, none of that has come from social media. And I think that just is so ingrained in us that it's something we need to do. And for me, that was one of the things for my last podcast. I was like, I'm actually not going to create any social assets. I'm not going to post about it on social media. And there are plenty of other ways I can grow this because I just hate doing all this stuff. And it takes up so much time. And there are other growth channels that I actually enjoy doing and that take less time and they're more fun for me. And so that would be certainly something to experiment with. And I know a lot of people have done that and have found that it's had zero impact on their growth, which may be because they weren't growing that much to begin with. But that's a good realization to have too, that you keep doing these things and you think like this is going to lead to growth. And then you stop doing them. And you're like, well, I'm not growing, but I wasn't anyway. So how else can I use that time?
Right.
All right, so let's move on to the attraction category, the second component here. And so this is all about how immediately attractive or appealing your show is to new potential listeners. So when they come across it, do their eyes light up when they are like, wow, this is the show I've been waiting for. I didn't know the show existed, but I didn't even realize I was waiting for it. And so some of the kind of key components of your show's level of attraction include your show's packaging. And so that's going to be your title, cover art, show description, episode titles, a lot of the kind of like first impressions that somebody will get from coming across your show, website as well, your social media profile. All those things send a signal to people when they come across them subconsciously within the first, half a second of coming across your show or your profile online. And does that tell people, yes, this is going to be worth my time? Your messaging is another key component there. So that kind of combines with the packaging to help people understand whether this show is a good fit for them. And then the third one here that we'll talk about in a little bit more depth is a unique and compelling show concept. And we've got an example of that coming up. So essentially, your show's level of attractiveness dictates how easy it is to market it. And so the more attractive your show, the faster, cheaper, and easier it's going to be to grow. And so regardless of what kind of exposure channels you're using to get out in front of people, whether that's paid, whether that's free, the more attractive your show, the better everything will work because people get it immediately. It is, highly appealing to them and they are immediately going to go down the rabbit hole and listen. That said, less immediately attractive shows can still be grown. They just take more time and effort. And so I have 2 newsletters. One is called Scrappy Podcasting and the other is called Creative Wayfinding. I've been doing Creative Wayfinding longer. It's the older newsletter. It's right now the bigger one, but Scrappy Podcasting is probably like, I've been doing that for 2 years fewer than Creative Wayfinding and is now almost at the same size. And it's just a way more appealing, hookier newsletter. And I'm kind of okay with that. There's reasons for me to do both of them, but I've experienced growing both of these, and Scrappy Podcasting is just a way easier newsletter to grow because the audience is clearer, the outcome, the promise is clearer, the format is clearer of that newsletter than Creative Wayfinding, which is more long form, kind of like my thoughts on running a creative business and building a creative career. Scrappy Podcasting is 1 2-minute, often unconventional tip per week on how to punch above your weight as an underdog podcaster. And so there's like an easier pitch that's like, you just get it when you come across it. Creative Wayfinding, I still don't even really know how to talk about it 3 years in because it is much more just like a reflection of me, more of like not like an art project necessarily, but it's not to achieve a specific end goal or anything like that. And so there are certainly reasons to grow a show that might not be immediately attractive. And that's not to say you shouldn't, do that, but just understand that if your show doesn't have a very clear hook right off the bat, you can't really expect to grow as fast as a lot of those shows out there that do. And that's just something that, we as creators have to accept. So some of the positive indicators that you have a highly attractive show, I've already mentioned this phrase, eyes light up moments a couple times. And this is the single best indicator of when you tell somebody about what your show's about, do their eyes genuinely light up and they're like, wow, like, and even better, if they pull out their phone immediately and they go click subscribe on the podcast. Do not confuse this with when you tell somebody about their show and they're like, oh yeah, that sounds really interesting. I'm totally going to check that out later. Because what they really mean is, I'm too polite to tell you that I'm not interested in your show at all. And I don't know even what it's about in the first place. And so when you are talking with people, this is one of the reasons it's so important to actually talk with people either in person or over Zoom calls, things like that, where you can actually gauge their response. And doing this will help you hone your pitch for your show, because maybe you have a really interesting, fantastic show, but your pitch is off and you don't know how to talk about it in an articulate way. Like, that is one of the key kind of factors that will be keeping you from growth. And so the more practice you can get, the more feedback you can get on that, the easier it's going to be to market it, both in in-person interactions as well as online. And the only really way to get that is by doing it to real people. And so get good at talking about your show, test out different variations of how you present it to people, and look for those eyes light up moments and do more of it. Other positive indicators include, if you are posting your episodes on social media or advertising or on your website, if you see high click-through rates, and so a good percentage of people who see those posts click the link, that's a good sign that clearly the point of your show is coming across. If you're getting positive comments and clicks on social media posts related to the show, that's a good sign as well, that people are, taking an interest. We all know how hard it is to come by those kinds of comments and clicks on social. And then a steady increase in growth is clearly a good sign, because it means that, okay, the show's not only getting in front of people, but people are actually coming back. And I would say especially it's a good sign if you're not focusing on certain growth channels and you see people coming in from elsewhere that you don't know where they might be coming in from. So some of the common issues when it comes to, how to diagnose if your show might not be as attractive as it maybe could be. And so one is that the show concept isn't really hooky enough. And so the concept is the, hopefully unique and compelling combination of your show's topic and the way in which you present it. And so we'll look at an example in a second of two versions of a podcast, two ways of presenting it. And you'll see that one is just much more compelling and interesting than the other. And so a lot of people start with a topic and say, I have a podcast about this. And it turns out that there are, dozens of other shows also talking about that thing. And so what we need to do is find a way to bring a unique method of presentation or some unique wrinkle to that topic that differentiates it from all the others in a compelling way, where when people come across it, they're like, wow, that's like a really interesting show. And in my experience, shows that really grow effortlessly have this immediately compelling concept. They're not doing it through, they're doing it through their marketing. And you can talk about like that the conception of the show is the most fundamental part of marketing. And so that would be the big part of marketing that they've spent a lot of time on. But also, when you have something that just has a great hook, you just put it out there in front of people and people, rapidly kind of glom onto it. So let's look at an example here. And I'm not sure if people will recognize the show, but it is one of the biggest in the business category. And so there's two kind of versions of this show. And this was actually the first one that they started out with before it really took off. And so they initially described it as a podcast where we interview successful entrepreneurs and uncover their secrets so you can apply them to your business. And this is like, okay, this and 10,000 other shows all could be described as this phrase. And even you think about like, okay, yeah, there is a niche here, I suppose. There's entrepreneurs, and yeah, I can see the benefit to it that, you can uncover their secrets so you can apply them to your business. But we've just heard this kind of description and promise so many times before that even if you are in that target market, there's no way you're actually clicking through the show because it just is entirely generic. Let's look at the second concept that they refined this to change the actual format of the show. And then as in accordance, they changed the way that they talked about it. And so that is what it is now, a podcast where we brainstorm potential $1 million business ideas based on trends and opportunities we see in the market. Sometimes we have famous guests and they do it with us. So this is the show, My First Million. It is, I think, in the top 10, often in the top 10 of the business category. And it has a fantastic premise that when you look at that show concept and the way it's described, immediately, this just feels like such a more valuable show that feels like they're doing real work on behalf of the listeners by using their expertise. They're looking for trends in the market, and they're basically synthesizing all this and saying like, okay, here's what we see, here's all the data, and here's a business that you could build that could potentially be $1 million business. Go do it. Take that idea and run with it. That is such a more valuable show and a more hooky show than interview successful entrepreneurs and uncover their secrets. That just feels kind of bland and boring. And yet that's where most of the shows in the business category have shows like that. And as a result, most of the shows are not ranking as highly as My First Million. So some other common issues would be poor messaging. And so just not understanding how to talk about the show in a way that gets people excited about it. And so some recommendations for that, I would say identify the benefits that listeners will get from the show and make sure you lean into those. Identify what differentiates your show from other similar shows that are out there on your topic. And then just make sure these two things, if you can be clear and concise about these two things, make sure that those are coming through in your messaging and how you talk about the show, because those are going to be the two things that provide relevance to a potential listener. That this is, something for someone like them. They understand what they're going to get out of it, and they understand why they would, rather listen to your show than another similar show on the topic. And if you can do those kind of three things there, you're going to have a much better time when you're talking about the show. I also mentioned packaging, and so we'll briefly look at a few points there. The one thing I would recommend is just compare your show, take screenshots of all the different cover arts in your category, and just put yours up alongside those in Canva or Figma or Photoshop or wherever. And if your show obviously feels lower quality from a design perspective, it's a good chance that you are probably missing out on listeners because of that. And we all judge books by their covers, whether we like it or not. And when there are 20 shows on a topic, our eyes are going to go to we're going to start disqualifying the ones that have poor design because we think subconsciously that that's reflective of the content inside, even if it's not. And so we're much more likely, we have to pick from 20 shows. We're going to take a risk with our time and say okay, I can only listen to one or two of these. Where am I going? We're going to look for all the indicators that there has been time and thought and intention that's gone into every aspect of the show. And usually based on, just a cursory glance at a bunch of different shows out there, and all we have to go on is design, probably we're going to go with the ones that have more professional, compelling design. And so this is something that I highly recommend working with a professional designer, even if you have to save up to do that, because this is one of those kind of one-time expenses that I've talked to many people that all they did was update their cover art design to something that was more professional, and their show just started growing way more quickly. So we've talked about a few ways to improve already, but a couple kind of pointers here. I would just say pitch your show regularly and gauge the responses of people. So talk to people, tell them about your show, gauge those responses, ask where they're getting lost, what isn't coming through. If you find yourself having to go through a 2-minute long description, see how you can shorten that down and play with that. Look out for other compelling shows and other media as well, and their formats and their concepts, and think about how you can improve your own show's hook. So when you start to notice them in the wild, then you'll start to see that's when you notice yourself having that reaction of wow, that show sounds so interesting. Examine that and think why is that? What makes this so interesting to me? And is there anything here that I could borrow and apply to my show? All right, so that is it for the attraction category. Any comments or questions on that before we move on?
I have a comment, and really just to reiterate this, messaging and packaging. It's super important for the growth of your show, but also really instrumental in the content creation process, I find, right? If you have a really clear and concise vision of what your podcast is and the format and who it's for, and have that align, you and your message and your audience and their values and beliefs and pains and things like that. If all those things are really well understood, not only will you grow your podcast really, really quickly, but you'll create content that is consistent and congruent with all of those things. And so it's so important and it's so hard, but I think it's no surprise that the really successful shows get that right. So they get both sides of that. They get the content creation side down really well, and they get the growth stuff that happens, I don't say on autopilot, but more easily than if you're struggling with it. Because they think when you struggle with it, it's evident on both sides.
Yeah. Yep. Love that note. All right. So 2 down, 2 to go. These last two we're not going to go into in quite as much depth. And I think that for the one reason for retention, this is where most of us tend to spend most of our time. And so with my example at the start here, I was creating 2 newsletters and a podcast. All of these were kind of this core trust building content in itself. Whereas if people got into those things, they were sticking around, they were high quality content. This is the stuff that, especially as if you identify as a creative, this is probably what you want to spend all of your time doing, and you want to make it really good. And so typically we do. But I want to say that the thing about this is we often need to shift our approach to how we create this content. And so for me, part of that was actually scaling back. And so I ended the podcast that I was doing because I realized I'm doing too much here. And the podcast was the least valuable kind of long form content thing, or was the least aligned long form content piece that I was doing at the time. And so I needed to free up time to focus on more exposure oriented activities and things like that. And so one of the things to think about with these long form pieces of content, this is podcasts, newsletters. YouTube does have that discoverability, but still like longer form videos would fall into this category, blogs, those types of things. The goal of these things is not actually to grow your audience. It is specifically to nurture and deepen your relationship with them. And so when we're creating this content, that's what we should be thinking about, is like the goal of each episode is to nurture and build a relationship with my audience. It's not to grow. It's not to reach new people. I'm reaching people elsewhere, directing them back to this, and then they're going to develop that relationship with me. And I think when we kind of make that shift in our stance, we do change the way we think about the content that we're creating. And a lot of that time that has a very positive impact on how we're creating it. And so, like I mentioned, this is kind of the bucket that we're funneling people towards. We're finding attention, getting our exposure elsewhere, directing it back to our shows. And that's where we're then deepening and building relationships with people. And so really, that's all about giving people value and like creating content that like actually resonates with them. And a lot of times I think content that resonates, there's kind of this like reach versus resonance potential. And usually things that have a lot of reach, if we're creating content to get mass exposure, those are not usually very resonant types of topics. They're more like, quick hit like Twitter threads or things like that, that there's not a lot of like emotional kind of resonance things to people to latch onto. Whereas the deeper, more complex stuff that really resonates with people and gets people like, really feeling like emotive when they're listening to our shows, those are things that don't really have that much growth potential. It's hard to like market that kind of stuff. It doesn't really go viral as much. And so thinking about like when we're creating episodes and when we're creating supporting kind of marketing content or anything like that, we want to make sure we're creating that with the goal in mind. If this is something I want to get out in front of a lot of people, that's a very different type of piece of content than something that I want to resonate deeply with people, where they are really like feeling like, oh man, we've had the same experience, we're on the same page, I really get this person, and I want to go deeper with them down their content rabbit hole. So
I'll just say there that like I think most all of us are too scared to be ultra specific there, right? I think most of us tend towards general. Hey, I want this to appeal to everybody. I don't want to ostracize or alienate anybody, and like all that is totally understandable. But I think the places where people have success are when they're ultra specific and ultra targeted with kind of everything they do, from the channel to the format to the content to the outreach and all that kind of stuff. Ultra specific. Maybe you can grow a little bit out from there. But I think early on, especially, the more specific you can get, like, is the better, and just don't be scared of it.
Yeah, I think early on, kind of like you said, you want to like, I often think about it as like trying to scale this rock face, and you just need to get like, it's really hard with like a really like blunt sledgehammer to like chip away at that kind of, you need to like a really focused chisel to make a dent in the rock wall. And so the narrower you can go, like the more likely you are to get a foothold in there where you can then start to like, scale out eventually from there. But I think thinking about early on, like, who are the 10 people who are going to really like resonate deeply with this content? Like, who are those 10 people that this is going to be the best show in the world for? And if you can create that, probably there's, they are representative of many more people, but it's hard to create something that resonates with anyone if you don't start with that narrow focus. And so that's a great, reminder there as well. So some of the positive indicators of doing well when it comes to this retention category of content would be, low drop off and high consumption rates. So if you look in your Spotify dashboard or Apple Podcasts, you can see how far people are listening through your episodes. And so if you're seeing that people are listening through the majority of your episodes, that's a great sign. You have a growing number of subscribers. And so this is something where, if people listen to the show, you get that download count. But if they don't come back, it's kind of like all that effort that went into getting that new listener didn't really amount to much. And so if our subscribers are growing, if our overall growth is going up, that means people are not only coming into the episodes, but they're actually sticking around. If you have a business that makes, offers a product or service, if people are buying from you that you can trace back to they were podcast listeners, that's a great sign that clearly people are resonating with your content enough to want to go even further. Similarly, if you have sponsors that people are buying from your sponsors, that's a great sign that they trust your opinion and they are, taking the action based on the people and the brands that you are presenting to them. Another great sign. Then regular DMs or emails from listeners, those are, very few and far between, especially at the start. And so when you get people sending those to you, that's a sign that like, okay, that's a high bar to get somebody to go out of their way to do that. And so this must have been really valuable. Like they are really resonating with this content. And then in a similar vein, listeners publicly posting about the show, again, does not happen all that often, especially early on. And so if you can get to that point, if you're seeing that, that is a fantastic sign. All right, some of the common issues that might be a problem if you are weak in this category and you're not seeing some of those good indicators. The first is just, the tough pill to swallow that we all have to, especially at the start of our creative journeys, is that the show simply isn't good enough. Most shows don't start out as good as they could be or will one day be. And so that is often an issue that's holding us back from more exposure, more growth, more retention, all of these things. It could be that, the content is generic or unoriginal. It's like, one of many other similar shows. It could be that the production or presentation quality is poor. Again, both of these are things that usually we start out there and we need to work through to get past at some point. It could also be that the structure could use some tweaking. So maybe there is, a base of a good show there, but there's something about the structure that is not engaging enough. And so maybe that's our hooks. And so at the start of the episode, how are we hooking people, keeping them, for every new listener who comes in the first minute or two, are we presenting them with something that pulls them in further through that next 5 or 10 minutes and gets them listening through the episode? And there's lots of, errors and kind of things that drive people away if we're getting into long kind of monologues and assuming that everybody already knows who we are because they've been listening forever. That's kind of off-putting to new listeners. And so thinking about, what is the very first impression a new listener who knows nothing about me or my show has in that first minute? Like, are they hooked enough to keep listening? Could also be, pacing, delivery, these types of more presentation aspects of the show could also be things that might need to be tweaked. How to improve? Study your favorite shows. I would just think, what keeps you coming back to your very favorite shows? If you just think about that, what is it? Why do you keep coming back week after week, month after month, whatever it is? Note that down and think about what that says about the show and maybe what you can apply to your own. You can look at how they structure their episodes, all of that kind of stuff. I would also, just think about trends in podcasting, marketing, and media as a whole. Just, you don't need to think too in depth about this, but just be aware of it. And is there a certain show type that is just, it used to be really popular, but it's just declining in popularity. So now you have this kind of headwind that's working against you if your show is in that space. Not necessarily, that doesn't mean that you should quit it, but it can help explain why, maybe this type of show isn't as popular as it once was. And that might be a reason for, why it might be hard to market right now. And then also just talk with listeners regularly and get their opinion and feedback, see what they like about the show, what they don't like, opportunities for improving things, different topics they would like to see on there. I like to keep a couple calendar slots open on my calendar. You can do this every week or every other week and just talk with people from your audience, open those up to them. And you will learn so much from those interviews, almost more than anything else you do. And so I would highly recommend doing it. It's uncomfortable at the start. And then once you do a few of them, it becomes a lot of fun. And then the last one, as we kind of already mentioned, is just narrow down your listener targeting further. All right, we're nearing the top of the hour, so we're going to go through these last few slides a little bit quickly. Revenue, this is a short one anyway, the final component here. And this is short because everybody is going to be a little bit different when it comes to this. And so essentially, this is how you monetize your work, products, services, sponsors, ads. Could be, there's many other things, tip jars, things like that. This is just much, much easier when you have all three of the other components in place. Not to say it takes care of itself, but if you're doing a really great job of getting exposure, attracting people back to the show and keeping them there, sales and any kind of monetization becomes a lot easier. So certainly something that they're still, putting together products and sales pages and all that kind of stuff is not easy, but it's a lot easier if you're doing all the other three categories well. So we've gone through this kind of EARS framework here. And so the next step that I would recommend, having gone through this, is to do an audit of your strategy. So I mentioned that I did this. This was the kind of thing that kicked off everything for me, of realizing where my gaps were, where I was over-indexing my time. I was spending a lot of time on the retention category, just creating tons and tons of content. That was the majority of my marketing time, was creating content and not doing much of the other stuff. And so I would just think about your current creative platform or business and give each of those EARS category a letter grade. And so, A+, there's nothing you could possibly do to improve it. It is perfection. B is maybe, decent, but there's some room for improvement. You've got some things in place, but they could certainly be improved. C is maybe okay, you're doing something, but it's not really getting results. And, I need to seriously address that. And then maybe a D-, the worst possible grade, is I'm not actually doing anything to address this category of my marketing. And so that's probably the big reason why I'm not getting results. And so you're going to probably come up with a list of things, and probably every category might have some notes that you have like, okay, well, this, I'm doing this, but it's not that great. Maybe I should, do something over here, add another kind of endeavor or initiative, another task to my weekly to-do list, whatever it is. And so when you get to that point, I would recommend prioritizing, going through that list and saying like, okay, here's all the things that I need to fix. How do I prioritize these things? So first, make the list, like I mentioned. And the one thing I'll note on that list, actually, the longer your list, the better news that is, because the more gaps that you have in your marketing, that indicates like there is potential for growth. If I fix these things, that's the reason why things aren't working as well as I would like. Whereas if you couldn't name a single thing, you were just like doing everything to perfection with your marketing and you still weren't growing, that's probably a sign that your show just has zero potential for growth because you're already doing everything to perfection. Like there's nothing else you can do. And so actually, the more mistakes you're currently making, the more gaps in your marketing, this is actually the most fantastic sign that you could have, because there's going to be a lot of low hanging fruit on that list that's actually going to start helping you improve things pretty quickly. And so that is actually a great place to be. So don't go easy on yourself, make that list, and then you start knocking those things off. And so how I would recommend prioritizing things, I would pick one category here. So say like, okay, I'm going to focus this, 3 months, 6 months, this year maybe on exposure or attraction or retention or whatever it is, and say like, this is everything that I'm doing. I'm going to maybe do a few small things here or there. I usually recommend going on a quarterly or annual basis, because a lot of this stuff just takes time to overhaul. And so for me, over the past year and a half, it was really focusing on exposure, kind of initially a little bit of attraction stuff. And then once I was confident that I was getting those eyes light up moments from a lot of my stuff, I was like, okay, now it's ready to start focusing on exposure. And so everything that I've been focused on for the past 9 months, I would say, has kind of just been like experiments with exposure. And when you focus on one category, you just like the results kind of compound a lot faster, because that's just where a lot of your mental energy is going. You start making kind of connections in the background without actively thinking through them. And your brain does a lot of the work for you. So that is it for our presentation here. Thank you so much for having me, Craig. And thank you for being here, everyone else. I put together a page at podcastmarketingacademy.com/Castos. And I actually built a kind of quiz tool that will deliver this audit for you. So if you want to go through that, you can find that over there. It takes 2 minutes. It's like 20 questions that will quiz you on what you're currently doing with your marketing. And then you'll get a grade, a score, and individually broken down by each category, along with some recommendations on what to do, most of which we've covered in the presentation today, but might be helpful to have a record of it there.
Awesome. Jeremy, thanks so much. We had one question from Bev, and I think you alluded to it, but I just want to give you a chance to expound on this a little bit. What did you specifically do to increase your growth from 32 subscribers to 771? And I would just add the caveat of it would be helpful to know if you think this is kind of universally applicable, or if there's just a framework that Bev and everyone else should take and kind of apply to this answer.
Yeah. So recently, the really large growth in the past few months has been much more, well, it's been many things, but has largely been advertising driven. But before I ever started that, the initial where it went from like 32 to 170 to 700, that was all, I wasn't doing any advertising there. And that was essentially, I looked at my newsletter specifically, and I was like, this is just not appealing enough. When this gets in front of people, people are not subscribing to it. And so I looked at like, what is the format of the newsletter in the first place? And so like, what's that hook? And then I looked at like, what does my design look like when somebody gets to the landing page? My little like shareable graphic. What is the cover art essentially? What does that look like? And I talked to people, and I was like, what do you like about this newsletter? What do you not like? What are you reading right now? And how can I distinguish this from those? And so it was really about messaging and design and crafting the actual format of that newsletter in particular. And then it became like, okay, well, now I'm going to start doing cross promotions. And I really am still leaning heavily into a lot of cross promotions, newsletter swaps, also swaps with other like podcasters, things like that, creators on other platforms. And at that point, then it was starting to get to like, okay, now this is really working. And I have some confidence that if I spend money on this, it's actually going to get me, results. Whereas before, I had actually tried advertising with it in the past, and it was like 15 times more expensive than it is now, because I had not optimized all those other things. And so that would be how I would approach it. And like I mentioned, advertising can be a great tool. It's also not necessary at all. I recommend doing it if you have a budget for it, but you can find growth opportunities in many other areas as well.
Awesome. I would just, I would echo that. And it is true in our business, it's true for our podcast, is kind of make sure your house is in order first. and that your bucket is not leaky, if you will. So the few people that come through really resonates. They're able to subscribe, get value, all that. And then you can start pouring in marketing strategies to the top. But yeah, if your design, your packaging, your messaging, all that is not really dialed in, then you are just going to be kind of missing out on any further kind of activities you have. Awesome. That will do it. So we're right at time. Perfect timing, as always. So Jeremy, thanks so much for coming on and sharing all your knowledge here. For folks who want to kind of reach out and get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that? Is it podcastmarketingacademy.com, or what's the best way to?
Yeah, I would say I'll just put that link again in the chat there. And so that's got all my contact information there. I'm mainly active on Twitter and LinkedIn, so you can look me up on either of those. LinkedIn, Jeremy Enns, Twitter at I am Jeremy Enns. And then that link should have email, I believe, and everything else to get a hold of me.
Okay, awesome. A recording of this will be available on the Crowdcast site. So if you all go back to Crowdcast later on today, log in, you should see this in the things you viewed, and you can either replay or download it there. And yeah, Jeremy, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge. Really, really great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right, everyone, have a great day. We'll chat soon. Thank you.